Have you ever flown on an airplane? If so, what's the longest flight you've taken? Did you know that it would take you 20 hours to fly from Toronto to Sydney? Whew, your plane better have a good movie selection. But today, we'll get to visit the Great White North and Down Under in about 10 minutes. Oh, and we won't forget our friends, the Kiwis, a nickname for New Zealanders. At one time, these far flung lands were all controlled by, you guessed it, the United Kingdom. Our guiding questions are: how did Canada, Australia, and New Zealand gain independence from Great Britain? How have Indigenous peoples been affected by European colonization? And our big picture question is: what does it mean to own land? Who has the authority to do so? Long before becoming a hockey hotbed and home of the world's greatest maple syrup, Canada was colonized by France in the 17th century, bringing fur trappers and missionaries. The French were on pretty good terms with indigenous communities, usually viewing the people as allies and trading partners. But in 1763, France lost Canada to Great Britain in the French and Indian War. English-speaking colonists struggled to coexist with the French. To quell tensions, the British Parliament created two provinces: English-speaking Upper Canada, now known as Ontario, and French-speaking Lower Canada, now known as Quebec. Despite some say in local affairs, both were still ruled by a British royal governor and a small group of wealthy British citizens. Educated middle-class professionals began to demand political and economic reforms in the early 19th century. These demands eventually evolved into full-fledged rebellions across both provinces, which subsequently became united into the province of Canada. As the US extended its territory across the continent, Canadians felt like they needed to protect their interests and their border, and demanded a strong, organized central government. The Dominion of Canada was established in 1867, adding Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. Canada became self-governing in domestic affairs with its own prime minister, but still answered to the British Crown. Canada gradually gained independence during the 20th century. In 1931, it was recognized as equal to the United Kingdom, and by 1982, it had full control over its constitution. Canada now includes 10 provinces and 3 territories, with Quebec still having a French-speaking majority. How did Canada gain independence from Great Britain? Respond using the chart in your PDF.
G'day, mate.
Is not likely how British sea captain James Cook first greeted the land down under when he arrived in 1770, but you might want to keep this phrase in your vocabulary if you visit. Australia enjoys low crime rates and is nicknamed the Lucky Country, which is surprising considering that it started off as a place to house prisoners. In an effort to ease the strain on overcrowded English jails, convicts were sent to the colony of New South Wales. Once free, they could buy land and settle. In the early 19th century, the British government encouraged immigration by offering cheap land, bringing farmers to Australia. Early control over the colony was exerted by military governors, who answered only to the British Parliament. Later, a legislative council and judicial system were established. Over time, the convict population was replaced by middle and working class colonists, who began to clamor for democratic reforms. This coincided with the discovery of gold, leading to immigration by wealth seekers. By the late 19th century, Australia enjoyed a booming economy and a high standard of living due to its natural resources. Gradual reforms like universal suffrage for white male colonists and a secret ballot were introduced, but Australia remained under British control. At this point, most Australians were native-born, albeit of European descent, and a distinct culture was forming, accompanied by expressions of Australian art. Don't worry, no animals were harmed in Tom Roberts' Shearing the Rams. This scene of collecting wool was common on Australian farms. Australia went through its own phase of Impressionism, portraying scenes of the country's picturesque landscape. Along with art, literature, such as Ethel Turner's Seven Little Australians, helped forge a national identity through common lived experiences. This bond led to nationalist movements, created with the goal of establishing a united and independent Australia. For most, however, the ideal was a white Australian identity. Indigenous peoples and Asian immigrants were not part of their grand vision. In 1901, the colonies joined together as the Commonwealth of Australia. While still under the dominion of the United Kingdom, ties were loosening, and in 1942, Australia officially became completely independent. How did Australia gain independence from Great Britain? Respond using the chart in your PDF. Hundreds of years before the Age of Discovery, the intrepid Maori set off from Polynesia and traveled across the Pacific on small boats, arriving in New Zealand. When Captain Cook got there, he didn't immediately colonize New Zealand. Rather, the British set up trading posts on the islands. Missionaries later came with the intention of converting the Maori to Christianity. After the settlers clashed with the Maori over land disputes, Britain annexed New Zealand in 1839. The Maori accepted British rule in exchange for recognition of their land rights, although the settlers routinely abused the terms of the agreement. By the mid-1860s, New Zealand was essentially self-governing. That status was recognized by the United Kingdom in 1907, and complete sovereignty was achieved in 1947. How did New Zealand gain independence from Great Britain? Respond using the chart in your PDF. During the push for independence in each of these countries, some voices went unheard. In Canada, the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people have native ancestry that dates back thousands of years. Despite their existing economic systems and distinct cultures, after British colonization they were forced to assimilate into what those of European descent considered Canadian culture. Traditional dress and customs were banned, and children were forced into residential schools, where they lived and were required to study Christianity and learn English. These schools continued until 1996. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples had occupied Australia and its surrounding islands for thousands of years before outside contact. Upon British arrival, many indigenous peoples succumbed to European diseases, and the British seized land and water sources. As administrative control over the colony was rather loose, some colonists kidnapped and enslaved indigenous Australians to work on their property. Thousands of indigenous lives were lost in European-led massacres in an effort to subdue local resistance and seize land. New Zealand's colonial relationship with indigenous peoples certainly wasn't perfect, but it wasn't quite as ugly. After annexation, the colonial British government forcefully confiscated land from the Maori during the New Zealand Wars, and at first, the Maori did not enjoy the same political freedoms. While they continued to face discrimination, aspects of New Zealand society became more progressive, and by 1867, Maori men were able to vote and participate in Parliament. In 1893, New Zealand became the first self-governing territory to give women, including Maori women, the right to vote. Indigenous peoples in these nations now benefit from the legal protection of their rights. In fact, all three countries rate among the best in the world on Freedom House's measure of government protection of civil liberties. However, particularly in Canada and Australia, there is much work to be done to overcome generations of oppression, as the unemployment rate in Indigenous communities remains significantly higher and life expectancy significantly lower than the rest of the population. How have Indigenous peoples been affected by European colonization? While independent, these three nations have maintained close ties with the United Kingdom. They played pivotal roles in the two world wars as British allies. Today, each recognizes the British monarch as its own, but purely in a ceremonial and not a political role. Each has its own prime minister and legislative body. As we wrap up this journey, how about next time, instead of traveling 11,000 miles from the UK, let's go just 12? Yep, we're headed to the Emerald Isle, Ireland. Why? Well, you know, because history is everywhere.
Hey, hey.